pursuits were very important, thinking about atheism and defining oneself as a sort of critic of religion seemed to be particularly important to me. So yes, I saw myself as an atheist. And actually some of my first encounters with Christianity actually happened at Cambridge, and they actually happened through encountering the very people that I was studying for my PhD thesis, which is really interesting. So one of the things that I assumed as an atheist and never really delved into was this idea that Christianity was in some kind of fundamental opposition with science. And I began doing my PhD, and I was really exploring quite deeply. We'd now probably use the term scientist to describe people like Francis Bacon and Robert Boyle, one of the founders, in Boyle's case, of modern chemistry. But they were natural philosophers of nature. And I was really interested, I was a historian of empire, and really interested in the relationship between the history of science, the history of empire. And yet it soon became apparent that not only did these, Boyle and Bacon in particular, but also others, Isaac Newton, take their faith very seriously, but also that their Christian faith was really at the very core of what they were doing. And so what I had dismissed, to be honest, as intellectual window dressing was actually, the more I read, for example, of Robert Boyle, the more I found him a man of deep Christian faith. And this was a kind of pebble in my shoe, as it were. It made me, it was a kind of stumbling block to my atheism. It by no means made me a Christian right then and there or anything, but it made me really need to take seriously this idea that one could be a deep intellect committed to what then is the foundation of modern science, and yet also a deeply theological thinker and a profoundly committed Christian, in Boyle's case in particular. And when I was at Oxford, Professor Peter Singer, who's one of the world's leading ethicists and philosophers, came to Oxford to give a series of lectures in ethics, the You Are Hero lectures. And I was, very much an atheist, but some of my friends were going to Singer's lectures, and I was really excited, of course, to go along too. Not the least bit excited too, because of course Singer is a fellow Australian. He was at Princeton at the time, but it was great to hear his Australian accent in the halls of Oxford. And the interesting thing is, so Singer's lectures were about, in a nutshell, they're really about our duties to others, and really grappled more deeply with the question, the kind of foundational question there, which is the value of human life. Because Singer, of course, being a utilitarian and also an atheist, actually pursues atheism in many ways to its kind of logical conclusion when it comes to grappling with this issue of, well, to what extent is human life inherently valuable? Singer says, well, no, there's no inherent value to human life. That's something of a kind of religious myth, a Christian fiction, which is actually entirely consistent with atheism, because the ultimate reality is not in any way spiritual if you're an atheist. And so I actually left Singer's lectures with a kind of intellectual vertigo, as it were, because I was still an atheist, and yet here was the kind of the leading atheist ethicist of the time, and he was arguing positions which were completely at odds with assumptions that I had kind of not really thought through, to be honest, but had always just assumed were entirely consistent with my atheism. The main one, of course, is this idea that, well, every human life is of equal moral worth and inherently precious and valuable. I'd always thought that was simply the case, and I'd also always really kind of assumed that that was something that all reasonable people would agree upon. And yet it's very clear from Singer's work, and I went away from those lectures and read more about Singer and read of course, Singer's work. And that is, of course, not a position which is sustained by atheism whatsoever. And so this really, in many ways, was a kind of turning point, in the sense that it made me rethink whether or not atheism could actually sustain my deepest ethical convictions.
Wow. So you were being prompted to think about these issues really for the first time by an atheist philosopher, Peter Singer, in this case. And Singer himself, I think, was willing to acknowledge that where that value you held about the inherent dignity and equality of all life was essentially a religious view. Would that be correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. What he says. In fact, in his philosophy, I won't go into it too much, but no, in fact, so his position is, look, if we want to think about ideas about human rights, for example, or rights that humans might have vis-a-vis rights that animals might have and so forth, we need to come up with an understanding of what this concept of personhood is. And in order to qualify for personhood, as it were, we need to kind of, in Singer's view, understand that people have different capacities, and different capacities mean that people, for example, who are profoundly intellectually disabled, for example, don't have those kinds of capacities. And so there's no inherent, as you were saying, there's no inherent sense of the value of human life whatsoever.
Atheist ethicist Peter Singer wrote, "When the death of a disabled infant will lead to the birth of another infant with better prospects of a happy life, the total amount of happiness will be greater if the disabled infant is killed, and that there is a lack of any clear boundary between the newborn infant, who is clearly not a person in the ethically relevant sense, and the young child, who is." In our book, Should the Baby Live?, my colleague Helga and I suggested that a period of 28 days after birth might be allowed before an infant is accepted as having the same right to life as others. End quote. Reading these barbaric and cruel thoughts by atheist philosophers brings to mind something written by atheist blogger Sarah Hayter, where she recounts an unfolding schism in the Freedom for Religion Foundation, where all the real scientists and biologists, it seems, are stepping down over a religious belief progressive atheists hold in redefining biological terms. In one of her closing paragraphs, she wrote, quote, "I wonder if I have greatly overestimated human reason. In the past, I had mostly thought about the ceiling that faith created, the ways in which religion hindered progress, scientific achievement, and understanding. But now, I think much more about the floor it creates. Perhaps without certain myths granting the power of the sacred to some fundamental truths, like the fact that there are two sexes, we would drive away from reality altogether." End quote. The same can be said of human dignity and human worth. Faith puts an absolute worth on human life. In atheism, there is no such worth. It's all relative utility, as atheist Peter Singer explained. And to any atheist who would say atheism is just a lack of belief, exactly, it offers nothing. Which is far different from the words of our Savior Jesus, the Christ, who said, quote, "Let the children come unto me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven." Christ is King of kings, Lord of lords. Every tongue will confess, every knee will bow. Absolutely.